Welcome everyone to another episode of Keto Chat. I am your host, Carole Freeman, certified nutritionist and creator of the Fast Track to Keto Success program. I'm so excited today to be here with Amber O'Hearn. And let me just give a quick little introduction for her, for those of you that don't know her. She's a Canadian-born, US-based carnivore and computer scientist who lives in Colorado. And she is a data scientist by profession. She's also a singer, writer, mathematician who also has been researching and experimenting with ketogenic and evolution-based diets since 1997. And I'm so excited to have you here. We met in Low Carb San Diego was the first time we met, and then we got to hang out at KetoCon as well. And so I'm so excited we finally get to do this interview. Welcome, Amber.
Thank you. I'm excited too.
Yeah, awesome. Well, just to start out with, will you share with us, your story, your background in, your work is in the, non-health world, right? So it's numbers and science and math. And how did you get on this exploration of health? And that's a terrible question. But anyways, I think you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, it's not a terrible question at all. Yes, you're right. So academically, I never did pursue anything nutritional or medical, though I did consider it a few times. I like science and biology and chemistry, but it's just not how my life turned out. I started pursuing more of the math and computer science and linguistics. But all along, I retained an interest in food and health, but I wasn't very systematic about it the way I was with other academic disciplines. I kind of just believed what the mainstream health outlets were telling me. I had no reason to believe otherwise until my own health started suffering. And the first evidence of that to me was with weight. I had started gaining weight. And when that first happened to me, I decided that the most logical thing to do was to get more strict with vegetarianism, because everyone knew that animal products were kind of the culprit there.
Yeah.
And exercising more. And that turned out to not really help me, even though I think probably some of the exercise did have a positive effect on my health, but it didn't help my weight at all, that's for sure. And so I just got stricter and stricter with vegetarianism for a while, until finally something clicked within me. I had heard of low carb diets, immediately dismissed them when I heard of them. But I decided to finally look and see what that was all about. And it just so happened that it was that year that Michael and Mary Dan Eads' book had just come out, Protein Power. And so that was what I found when I went searching in the bookstore for a book on low carb diets, and it completely changed my life.
I still have yet to read that book. Came out before my, my love of low carb and keto. So I gotta go back and read that, because that's kind of a foundational book of, one of the first, pieces in this movement that we're in right now. So I should really go read that book.
I think you should, because it's aged really well, even though we've learned so much about the science behind low carb diets that they just didn't have available to them at that time. Not that it was free of science, it was absolutely chock full, and that was part of what I loved about it. But everything that they're saying still stands. However, I happen to have heard through the grapevine that they're coming out with a version 2 of that book.
Cool.
So maybe that'll be the one to read.
Yeah, like the updated version, or if it's all new, I should read both of them. So it's kind of like the original.
I guess we'll see how much it ends up diverging.
Yeah. So what was that like then? How did that influence your eating, going from vegetarian to protein? I just said protein power. What kind of transition was that like?
Well, I obviously reintroduced animal products, though I certainly wasn't a carnivore at that time. It was just that I stopped trying to avoid them and avoided instead carbohydrates. And of course, as you would expect from in our beautiful hindsight now, that had completely turned around my weight. I was much happier, and yeah, I lost 30 pounds at that time, which was all I was looking to lose. And it was the beginning of a new journey for me.
Yeah, awesome. I want to dive in a little bit more to the transition from vegetarian to reintroducing some animal protein foods, because I know, I've had my own clients and my own journey. Actually, I did swung the pendulum to vegetarian, vegan, raw foodist, and then got really sick and had to reintroduce animal food. So I'm curious, what were the reasons that you were vegetarian? Was it purely health? Did you have some of those, the ethical, moral things that people were coming up with, like eating animals is just bad and cruel, or, what was going on for you at that time?
Well, there was a mix because I was brought up in a vegetarian home.
Okay.
We ate eggs and sometimes fish and even occasionally chicken, and it wasn't a super strict thing from on high where we weren't allowed to eat meat out of the home, but in our home, that was the way we did things. And we had books around describing how to construct a well-formulated diet, which is, as you might know, kind of hard with a vegetarian diet to get all the proteins complete and such. And that was driven by moral concerns about animals, just not killing animals, which it's something that I have had to come to terms with, that another life is taken to support mine, and that's the way the world works. So that wasn't easy, but I know that some people who transition from a vegetarian diet to adding meat back in have reported that they didn't feel, they weren't sure they were going to be able to digest it, and concerns like that. It never occurred to me to worry about that, and I didn't have any issues like that.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's interesting because when I was in Bastyr, school at Bastyr, and I spent 5 years there because I did 2 different programs. Oh, and plug for my coffee mug that I've got.
Nice.
This is not sponsored by them at all. It's just where I went to school. But it was interesting though, because there were a lot of people that came into school as vegetarians, and then as they learned about nutrition, they transitioned to, more of an omnivorous diet, or definitely an omnivorous diet, because they learned that, like, oh wow, there's these things that we need from animal foods that you can't get from plants. But I remember actually going out to dinner, like one of our early class assignments was was trying to create some kind of a cultural experience, but the assignment was to go to some kind of ethnic food restaurant, right? Like, a very pseudo ethnic multicultural experience, right? And so I remember the group that I ended up going with was 2 vegetarians and me, and they, we had to very carefully figure out what we were going to order. And I remember saying something to one of the ladies like, oh, well, this says it has like, some broth in it. And she says, well, we got to make sure that it's not animal broth. And I was like, well, is it really gonna, like, she says, well, we won't be able to digest that. We haven't had animal proteins in so long, and we'll never be able to digest any animal protein at all. We'll just be bound up and cramped and bloated. And everyone I've ever talked to that's been vegetarian and then introduced some animal protein, it's just never happened.
No, I think our digestive systems are very adept at dealing with protein and fat from animals. If anything, that's exactly what they're adapted to optimally. And it's the plants that sometimes take some time to readjust to, with all the fiber and different enzymes that might be needed for their digestion.
Yeah, that's exactly my experience as well. Vegetarian, adding animal proteins, no digestive problems. But anytime I've cut out certain plant foods and then I reintroduce them, that's where the gas and cramping and bloating comes in. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So, okay. So then you lost 30 pounds following a low carb approach, and you're swimming along happily for a few years. And then what happens?
Well, yeah, it was absolutely easy to maintain, and life was good. And I went on with pursuing other goals and stopped worrying about that. And then I still had some issues with depression, which I didn't connect with diet at all. And that followed me in the background, kind of bubbling. And then I started having weight issues again, and it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly what happened because I had pregnancies, and during my pregnancies I didn't stay low carb all of the time, and not because I was worried about the healthfulness of it, but because the cravings were just out of this world. And I think it was just my body saying pack on the fat, and that was the way I knew how to do it, so I did it. But then postpartum, even returning to a low carb diet, I didn't lose all the weight. So I had a couple of iterations of that. And then I went into this phase where even though I was eating a low carb diet and had been for a really long time by that point, so I wasn't making any silly mistakes about it, but I began gradually gaining weight. And that was so frustrating to me because I had been advocating low carb diets to friends. I had begun to write about it on forums on the internet, and to see it not working for me was a cognitive dissonance that I didn't know how to cope with, especially since there was science behind it that was very watertight. And I also knew that if I went off it, because sometimes I'd say, well, screw this, if it's not even helping me with my weight, why not just have the dang donut, right? And if I did that, I would immediately I'd put on water weight, but I would continue to gain without bound until I went back on the diet. So then there was a little bit of a period of yo-yoing with despair and giving it up and then trying again, and it would take me back down, but not all the way down, and a bit of a creeping up through that process.
Yeah.
So by the end of 2008, I was over 195 pounds. I stopped looking at the scale, really. I was trying ridiculous things like detox things for my liver and all. I have a crazy apothecary full of things that I thought might be my problem.
Yeah.
and none of them helped, of course, and I just ended up wasting a lot of money. And it was then the end of 2008 that I came across a forum called Zeroing In on Health. And in that forum, people had given up all plants and they were eating what they called a zero carb diet. Zero carb is still a commonly used word for this diet, but I like to mention that it doesn't really mean getting your carbs to zero exactly, because fiber, for example, the whole net carb thing, fiber counts in terms of a zero carb diet. The whole idea for those of us is that if it's a plant, you don't eat it. If it's from the animal kingdom, you do. And then, a lot of people won't have things like milk that are also high in carbohydrates. So there's a bit of a hybridization going on.
Okay.
Anyway, when I saw them, a lot of them were people who were in my situation, who had been on a very low carb diet for a long term and either had regained or just wasn't getting them to where they wanted to be, but that when they tried going off of plants, suddenly they quickly lost the weight that they wanted, or at least lost most of the weight that they wanted. And more than that, they were finding unexpected surprise health benefits. And that's why the forum was called Zeroing In on Health, because what they were, the surprising and the aspect of it, they wanted to emphasize that this is actually a healthy thing to do. It's not just a fad way to get back to your desired weight.
That's, yeah, really cool. And I'm going to throw in a confession story right here. So, I have, a bachelor's and a master's degree in nutrition. I was teaching nutrition classes at a school down in Portland before I had my accident and found, my own keto diet. And so I don't know if it was that forum or another blog, but I remember in my classes. So I in grad school, we learned about a ketogenic diet this much, right? All was discussed was oh, this is a diet that you can use to treat epilepsy therapeutically, in a medical setting, right?
Yes.
That's it. No details about what it was or behind the scenes or biochemistry of any of it, right? We didn't learn about ketone bodies or anything. And so I remember in class, one of the classes I was teaching was kind of on, the history of diets, basically, both, weight loss and other diets. And I remember bringing in, there was a blog that was going around, this would have been maybe around 4 or 5 years ago, where it was a family, so husband, wife, and their kids, that were basically zero carb. And they only ate like red meat, and they were talking about how that they didn't even, like, the grass-fed stuff didn't even work. Like, what they felt best on was like grocery store, like red meat, and just eating a big giant steak for dinner, right? And I was just like, this is insane, this is extreme. And I brought it up in class to just kind of like poke fun at it, like, look how ridiculous this is. And the article talked about how they had plenty of energy, and that she didn't need to exercise a lot. In fact, she only like walked like 15 or 20 minutes a day. And I took that to say, like, well, look, she doesn't have any energy to even be active. Like, she can only move 15 or 20 minutes per day. And how ridiculous is this? And how many nutrients are they devoid of in their diet? And they probably just lay around and they're so lethargic all day long because they have no energy. And so that was my perspective on this zero carb, what was, often is called zero carb approach, right? Because I had no understanding of ketosis and alternative energy sources. And then all of the, the fact that most of these RDAs and nutrients that we need are in a context of a really high carb diet, and on and on and on. So I've very much done a 180, and maybe even farther than that as far as my perspective on that. I personally can't imagine that I could follow a zero carb or 100% carnivore diet. But 4 years ago, I couldn't even imagine following a ketogenic diet. So my mind is open to it, and I love that we're talking about this as well, because I do I do believe that plants are overrated. And so that's where I'd like to kind of take this next, is let's talk about that. Like, we've been told that you need like 47 servings of fruits and vegetables per day to be healthy. And that's like known, like, you have to have lots of fruits and vegetables to be healthy. So let's talk about that.
Right. Well, I just want to say you should give yourself a break, because it's a totally normal response to that difference from what we're taught is healthy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Even low carb, when I first heard of it back before, I thought it was the most obviously wrong and stupid idea I'd ever heard. That's why I didn't look any further. Like, just with one sentence looking at it, it was like, of course not.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that having an open mind is a prerequisite for almost everyone who's even in the ketogenic world today. Less so today. It's gotten more mainstream, but it does take a willingness to re-examine what you've been taught, and look at what people's experiences are and what the science might be. So bravo to you.
Yeah. And, I have to say that was the one thing that I did always tell my students was, like, whatever I'm teaching you now, like, do not take that as like, okay, I've learned it all, like next thing in life. Like, always have an open mind, always be learning, because there's so much about nutrition that we just don't even know. And here I was, like, presenting this as like, this is crazy. But I, should have taken my own advice at that time of having a more open mind to, like, all right, so, what is this and how is it working? So, so how did you then go? Okay, so you started exploring this zero carb diet based on this forum that you found. So walk us through kind of that transition of low carb to zero. Well, not necessarily zero carb, but the carnivore path that you're on now.
Well, like you said about imagining eating that way, even for me, who'd been eating low carb for a long time, like you have, the idea of just having meat seemed really heavy. How am I even going to do this? Not even a salad for days on end. And the only way that I was really able to try it was to give myself a very limited time. I said, I will do this for 3 weeks. And then I will, well, my plan actually at that time was to then have a piece of birthday cake. I planned it to end on my birthday so that I could be done with that. And not only that, but I kind of had to work up to it. So I planned the start date, and I prepared myself for days before the start date, just just getting myself in the right mental space, telling myself it was temporary, thinking about what the goal was, and making sure I had menus planned for myself so that I wouldn't be hungry, all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Before I could get over the hump of actually trying something that seemed to me that, the word that just came to mind was insane. But that different, really, I guess, is what it comes down to.
Yeah.
And then I dove in, and then it was just easy.
Mm.
It was just easy. The first couple of days, the way I started was I didn't want to have anything that was contaminating it. I was a coffee drinker, and I didn't want to be going through coffee withdrawal, so I kept coffee. But I cut out all spices. I didn't even use salt. I just had basically steaks for the first couple of weeks. I don't remember exactly what I ate, but I have a few very fond memories of ribeyes and nothing else on the plate, and how disorienting that whole feeling was. But so it seemed a little bit bland at first because I was just used to that taste overload. But as my taste buds adjusted, that subsided, and I began to actually taste meat for the first time in a way that I never really had. Because even though I'd been eating meat for well over a decade on a regular basis, by that time I tended to overcook it and overspice it by my standards now, because I just wasn't used to what meat could bring to the palate. And it took some time to redevelop that.
Yeah. So what about, I've got some questions that pop up that are probably common questions that you get. I think they're common to, keto in general as well too. The first one is, well, don't you miss, like I got that in the beginning when I went keto, like, are you never going to have a beer or a sweet potato again? And, so what do you say when people are like, but don't you miss XYZ? Like, what do you say to that?
Well, I would say yes and no. And by no, because of this process of my taste buds changing, I just began to look at what is food in a different way. So in the same way that if you're used to having sort of, I hate the term, but real food, you might walk by a case that has that kind of blue icing cake in the area of the grocery where you don't really want to go. You don't really see that as food, right? It just kind of looks like plastic to me. And I wouldn't say that fruits and vegetables look like plastic to me exactly, but they do just kind of look like flowers. They're pretty. If I spend a lot of mental energy, I could say, oh yeah, I remember how that tasted, and especially if I imagine it with a lot of butter, and yeah, that was good, I enjoyed that. But I just don't even see it as food. On the other hand, the first several years that I was on a carnivore diet, I made one exception every year. I used to go to the conference for the Association of Computational Linguistics. And every year when I went there, I would go out one night with all the colleagues that I had there and drink beer to my heart's content. And fortunately for me, I don't have celiac, so I didn't have any kind of acute, horrible response to it. And it didn't have any long-term effect. And so that's the kind of yes part. There are things that I miss, and I've figured out a way to add those into my life in a way that's self-contained and not dangerous to me. And when I say not dangerous, I mean, I think there's potential for a slippery slope. If you say, well, maybe I'll have asparagus because I really like asparagus at this event, then if you're doing that this week and then you see something else you like the next week, before you know it, you may just be back on a ketogenic diet of the garden variety. And that might be fine for you.
Garden variety, no pun intended, right?
Sorry, I snuck that in there. But for me, it's really important not to do that because of what happened to me after I tried it. Even within that 3-week trial, what happened was, not only did I start losing that weight that I wanted to lose so desperately by that time, but suddenly an unexpected thing happened. My mood, which had been going from depression to really quite off the rails, I had been re-diagnosed with a form of bipolar disorder, and it was quite horrible in many ways, but my mood settled down,
Mm.
and I had this new mental clarity and emotional clarity that I hadn't experienced for as long as I could remember at that point, maybe
Mm.
ever.
Wow. Wow.
If you think about, I know a lot of people have experienced mental clarity with a ketogenic diet alone. For
Yeah.
me, the difference was that again.
Mm.
And so once I realized that, and because that mood disorder was affecting me so acutely in my life at that time, when I realized that I had found a way to cope with that,
Yeah.
then I knew, oh, there isn't going to be any birthday cake, and I am not sorry, because it was exhilarating to have found that.
Yeah, that's really powerful too, and it's so true because so many times, even on a ketogenic diet, and even with people following a carnivore diet, like they get that amazing feeling of calm and peace and vibrant health, and it's like there's no question, like why would I want to sacrifice that for stupid sweet potatoes or something
Right.
like
I
no,
did
it
try
does.
sweet potatoes once. It was soon after, maybe a year after I'd been carnivore, and the idea of safe starches came out. I don't even know if you remember that big, huge hullabaloo where the likes of Jaminet and others were talking about how it's okay in the paleo realm to have safe starches. By safe, they mean ones that don't have the kinds of toxic compounds that all plants, including sweet potatoes, actually do have. But the lull was too much, and I did try it. And what happened was, so I bought some sweet potatoes, cooked them. We had them that night. There were some left over. My cravings went through the roof, and I just said, you
Mm.
know what, this is not for me.
Yeah, yeah. I remember you talking about that I'm pretty sure it was in Texas where like one of the big motivators is just not having the constant cravings and obsession, right? Like um
Yes.
it's really freeing to not be obsessed about food anymore. And I've experienced that myself with like before I was a foodie, right? And I loved to anytime I was going to travel anywhere, the first thing I would do was plan out all the restaurants I wanted to visit and I'd spend a great deal of time planning elaborate meals and spend hours and hours cooking and then after getting the stable blood sugar on a ketogenic diet, it's like I just don't even. The first time I had that awareness that I no longer was obsessed with food was a couple of years ago when I was first going to go to Phoenix. And it was like, a day or two before I was going, and somebody says, "Oh, are you going to go eat at XYZ restaurant and this and that? And where are you going to go eat when you go there?" And I was like, "Oh, that's funny," because I didn't even think about where I was going to eat at all. The entire time I was there, I was just excited to go see some sunshine. And I was like, that is so weird and bizarre. And it was, I was just no longer obsessed with it. And also knowing like I could figure out something to eat wherever I go. And so it wasn't even anything I had to like plan and carefully plot out, but I also mostly just didn't even care about it. So that freedom from cravings is really powerful motivator.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
So what about vitamins? Aren't you missing tons of vitamins and minerals? Like what this is another like devil's advocate question that I'm sure you get a lot of.
Yeah, and I want to get back to that question I didn't answer earlier. I didn't mean to duck it, about
Oh,
the recommendations for plants eating many
oh
servings
yeah,
per
yeah.
day, and just the idea that, of course, they're healthy for us. Well, after I discovered this diet, of course, that became a concern for me. I thought,
Mhm.
oh, maybe this is making me feel good and is good for my mood, but aren't I compromising my health in another way by not doing that?
Mhm.
And so I started trying to figure out, well, what are those recommendations based on? How can I make up for it? What foods should I look into maybe reintroducing if I need to? And I was really astonished to find that in a similar way to the way that the advice about saturated fat and red meat is actually based on very little science at all, despite the heavy-handed recommendations. The advice for eating fruits and vegetables is this based on the same kind of evidence. which is to say it's based on looking at epidemiological studies of different societies, none of which had the comparison of some of them eat vegetables and some of them don't, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or observational studies that are really easy to conflate because we have people that are really health conscious, eating a lot of vegetables, doing a lot of exercise, giving up smoking, and generally being really compliant with whatever it is that the doctors tell them to do. And yes, they have better health outcomes, but it's really unclear whether that's despite eating vegetables or because of. And then finally, there are the kind of studies that where a scientist will isolate a little component from a vegetable and say, look at this, if we isolate this and concentrate it and give it to a mouse in which we induced a terrible disease and give it at huge concentration, it might reverse it. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it just kills them and they don't report that study because plants are really full of toxins, all of those components that they're getting at, with the exception of vitamins, and I will get to that, but many of those components that people say are so important, the phytochemicals or phytonutrients, which is the trendy term for them now to make it sound like it's something we need, are really functionally for the plant something they evolved to kill predators that are trying to eat them. Is if you can't run away, you need some other kind of defense, or those plants wouldn't have survived to this age.
Yeah. Yeah. And this whole topic is something that's just not anywhere out there, in mainstream nutrition. Nobody's talking about the fact that plants actually have toxins in them. And, that's one of the reasons why they're not so healthful that we're told that they are. So go ahead. I cut you off. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah, to your point, almost every plant that we know of is toxic to humans. Maybe, I don't know, I'm going to say 99%, which is a number I pulled out of the air, but it's something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Almost, and all the ones that aren't, all the ones that we eat in our supermarket, almost all of them were bred varieties from things that were from the few that we found that were little enough toxic that we could tolerate them.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, we've bred the toxicity lower in order to be able to continue it, but we never get rid of it completely.
Yeah, yeah. So right now, a lot of people are listening to this going like, what are you talking about, toxins in plants? So can you kind of, give us some general categories of those and some examples?
Sure. There are cyanogenic glucosides, which you would find I think they're mainly in nightshades, unless I'm confusing it. But for sure, that's in roots like tapioca. And in fact, that one I've looked into a bit because it's actually a problem in some African countries where they're using it as a staple because it grows really well in droughts. But not only does it grow well in droughts, but the toxins are concentrated in those droughts.
Oh, yeah.
And an ounce of that from a particularly toxic variety could kill a rat. That's how bad it is. And it's so bad that there are reports of maybe up to 5% of the population having neuropathy or irreversible paralysis due to eating that. Now, we have tapioca here and it's gone through processing and it should be pretty safe. Mm-hmm. But if you're talking about just pulling the root up out of the ground and eating it, that is absolutely a no-no.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and there's lots and lots. I'm really interested in this whole topic of plant toxins, right? I think it's really fascinating, especially because it's, the opposite of what we've been told for so long about fruits and vegetables. And, when I was teaching those classes, I did talk about, anti-nutrients, which is the understanding I had at that point, which were, lectins and phytates and oxalates were kind of the main categories that I knew of. And basically my understanding of them was that they bound to the minerals that were in plants and they made it really hard for us to get the minerals out of the plants. And so we have our databases when people look up like a certain fruit or vegetable and it says you have this much of this nutrient in there, what people don't understand is that that's if we could chemically break it down in the lab, that's how much of that nutrient's in there. But in our bodies, that doesn't happen that way. And especially with these anti-nutrients that are in there that are binding them up. And that was my basic understanding of that. And then when I heard Sally Norton talk at Ancestral Health Symposium, it was like, she talked about oxalates even more, about not only do they bind up the minerals, but they're actually toxic in our body, or not even toxic, but just extremely harmful in our body. And so that was like, oh, it's more, there's so much more on this topic that is just not even being explored or looked at, or it's just being ignored, right? Because, well, if we can't eat fat, we got to eat carbs, we got to eat plants, right? So
anti-nutrients are really important. Like you said, you can't just look at the count of some nutrient in a plant and say that's how much we're getting, because if you're not taking the anti-nutrients into account, sometimes a plant food can actually be a net negative. Yeah, so it's one of the strategies that a plant would take. So some of them were direct, or are direct toxins. So this is going to kill the thing that chomps on this leaf.
Yeah.
And some of them are more indirect. So it's going to eat the leaf, go home, and end up not maturing as an insect, because not reaching the level of reproduction, because it actually couldn't get the nutrition that it needed, even though it got satiated on the plant.
Yeah.
And I think that's happening to us.
Yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. When I was at in my grad school program, I think it was the first year they were bringing out our bioactive compounds class. So this was, phytonutrient class basically, and it was cutting edge science, except for most of it was like looking at preliminary studies where they were starting to identify these compounds in plants that they were saying were, phytonutrients. Like you said, they're trying to create a term. But what they found is, in very small doses, the action that caused in the body was kind of like this homeopathic reaction, right? Like if you give somebody a tiny little bit of poison, their body mounts a response to that, and it looks like healing, that thing or that compound caused healing, but really it instigated the body's own immune response, right? And so it kicked it up into high gear. And that's my understanding of what these phytonutrients are really doing, and why they're beneficial is that a small amount has this enhancing our immune response in the body. But people then mistakenly think that well, if some is good, more is better. So we need to start juicing and creating all these smoothies, and we need to eat as much plant material as possible so we can get as much of these in. And this isn't.
Yes, so sulforaphane, I think, is probably a good example of that. You'll see a lot about how it's supposed to be good for the nervous system, for neurons, and there may be some truth to that in certain contexts, but the way it operates is, as you say, it's a toxin. If people really want to promote that idea and be honest about it, they'll call it hormesis, where the idea is what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. But like you said, maybe that's something to do in certain cases, but to bombard your system with high doses day after day after day, then that's basically, it's a toxin. So it might be something worth considering in some fancy protocol in which you intermittently do it, but I wouldn't recommend it as a general health strategy.
Yeah. Okay. So then I want to talk about the very controversial topic of fiber and gut health. Don't you need fiber? And you've got, there's a big part of the ketogenic community and practitioners out there that are, very adamant that we need a certain amount of fiber, prebiotic and probiotic fiber to keep our gut healthy. Let's talk about that.
Sure, yeah. So I think the first idea about why fiber might be healthy came from Burkitt, who was comparing Western diet societies and some societies of modern hunter-gatherers that he looked at, and was trying to figure out why are some of them healthy and Western societies are not. And one thing that he noticed in some of those hunter-gatherer societies, and not all, there are fiber-free hunter-gatherer societies, but they had a higher intake of fiber. And he thought, well, maybe the fiber is giving the benefit. And he particularly thought that it would be important for digestive health because they didn't have diverticulosis and that kind of bowel trouble. And all of that has spurred this huge myth around that, which I think boils down to the fact that if you replace some refined carbohydrate with fiber, yes, that's better. Absolutely, it's better.
Yeah.
But if you've already removed all of the carbohydrate or most of the carbohydrate from your diet, then whether you can argue that adding more fiber is going to give you additional benefit in that way seems quite unwarranted, especially if you then look at the data on bowel diseases like inflammatory bowel disorders or Crohn's disease. Many of the recommendations for people suffering from those is actually to remove fiber because it's very aggravating to the gut lining. I think that what happens is that the gut actually has an inflammatory response, and there can be a bit of also, again, a hormetic thing going where they build up and cover it with mucus, and that might be protective in some way, but to then just keep ravaging it with more and more fiber is not, again, a really great health strategy.
Yeah.
More recently, because of the new exciting area of research of the microbiome, that idea has come up again, and that's where we get into the idea of probiotics and prebiotics. And it comes back to the thing you had said earlier about if you took some plant food out of your diet and then reintroduced it, suddenly you're having a lot of trouble digesting. Well, I think that what is going on there, one of the things that's going on there is that your gut responds really quite quickly to changes in diet over a matter of days, but it does take days. And if there is a kind of plant that you've got going in your diet that will feed a certain strain of bacteria, once that bacteria starts to really grow, then you'll be able to tolerate that food a lot better. But if you haven't been feeding that strain of bacteria, then when you introduce that kind of food, there isn't anything in your gut to get in between you and your intestinal wall to protect you. And so in that way of looking at it, then yes, feeding those strains of bacteria could be helpful. But if you've taken out the plant, if you're no longer putting that kind of plant through your digestive system, then I don't see any more argument for feeding the bacteria that you need to cope with that particular plant. It's kind of circular.
Yeah. Well, and I want to pick your brain or like just pose this to you and see what you think or what idea you have about this. Cause I've asked this of other, what I call them, like pro gut health advocates. I've posed this question about like, okay, so, when I, eat certain foods now, like if I eat something with gluten in it or inulin, I seem to be really sensitive to as well. And it just causes gas and bloating. And from my understanding is that, gas is caused by bacteria eating that and creating carbon dioxide, right? So I'm like, how, what like if those bacteria aren't there, or maybe are they lying dormant and then they just eat it and they overpopulate, and then like if there's more of them eating that, wouldn't it make more gas? Like I just don't quite understand like what's really going on there that's causing the gas and bloating that gets better the more bacteria that grow. Like tell me more about, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't have a very refined concept of that either, and my understanding is the same, that it's the gaseous products of eating and of reproduction of those bacteria, and there's no amount of growing those strains that should eliminate that, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what accounts for the difference between some people having more gas as a response than others, but I would agree that it must be coming from the bacteria. And even people, who advocate having something like resistant starch to add to your ketogenic diet because it's non-caloric, it's non-carb, it's not any kind of digestible carbohydrate. Even they openly, readily admit that, yes, it's going to make you gaseous. Uh,
Yeah.
it doesn't go away.
It seems so. I wonder if there's just something missing in that whole, like, what we know about. I know there's tons of stuff missing about what we know about the gut, right? But it seems
There's
like
plenty
maybe
missing in my knowledge, that's for
yeah.
sure.
So there's something missing in that equation, because it seems like if you were feeding your gut bacteria, you would just be, the more you ate of that, the more gassy and bloaty you'd get. Like, it wouldn't get better. And so there's something happening that if you eat it for long enough, that it gets better and the gas and bloating go away for the
I
most.
think for some people it doesn't, though.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and
Yeah,
definitely.
that's a great question. I'm going to go home and research that now.
Okay. Oh, good. Because I've posed that to a couple of people that are, gut experts, and they don't really have a good explanation for me. So it seems like, maybe there's some, like, if the population I'm just throwing this out. If the population gets big enough, they also start to make some kind of another enzyme that helps break that down. I don't know. There's got to be something
Yes,
there, right?
there could be enzyme upregulation going on. That's a really good hypothesis. Another thing that just came to mind while we were talking about it, I don't know if it makes any sense, but maybe there are kind of strains that are similar, and some of them, the ones that are, so suppose we're talking about cabbage. Suppose you put some cabbage down the hatch, and there's some bacteria in there that are going to eat it, and they do, but they're not the best ones for cabbage. And so it takes some time for better ones to develop.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes any
I like
sense
that.
at all.
Yeah, no, I like that idea. Yeah. No, this is the fun of talking to really smart people, is that you can come up with all these different theories, and then, hey, somebody go research that and we'll figure this out. And that's, how we learn more about what we don't know. But, and I have the experience of, like, I can eat raw cabbage all day long, no problem. But if cooked cabbage, that doesn't work well for me. That causes gas and bloating, right? And usually it's the opposite problem for people.
That's what I've heard, yeah.
Yeah, so that's just another, like, weird thing, with digestion. That's like, all right, who knows why that is, but it must be something that changes that. Yeah, I like your theory about the different type, the good, better, best bacteria for digesting that. Yeah. All right. Okay.
Just another thing that made me think of, sometimes I think that certain probiotics might, if they do improve your well-being, it might be because they're pushing out a strain that's bad.
Yeah.
That's causing you problems, more than that the strain that's developing is itself good. It might just be that the competition that it's induced is helping you in some way.
So the last question about the fiber then is that, that most people think of, like, well, don't you need fiber to go number 2 every day? Like, isn't that what makes
Tell
us
that to a lion.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a pretty big myth. I still go number 2 for sure. Not every day. It is quite noticeable that the less fiber you eat, the less volume you will have moving through your bowels. But that's just because fiber is undigestible, so it has to come out. And I think also there may be remains of bacterial turnover that if they were eating fiber, then there's going to be some mass of finished bacterial carcasses that have got to go out as well. So yes, I don't have as much bowel content volume as I used to, but it's not constipation. It's not that I have it there and I can't get it out. It's just there's not as much to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Let's see. So another question for you. Do you think everyone should be a carnivore?
I think everyone should try it, just because it's such an interesting experience, and because a lot of people who have gone from a very low carb diet to a carnivorous diet have seen amazing and unexpected positive changes in their health. And to have that possibility and miss it seems like a really sad thing to miss. But I don't think that everybody needs to eat carnivorously all the time. I think we have different ability to tolerate vegetables and to tolerate plant matter. And if you can eat plants and it doesn't, and because you tried not doing it, that you feel just as good with them, or you feel good with some and not others, then by all means enjoy it. Have one for me.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Yeah. And I'm going to ask the boring question that you're probably tired of getting asked, but everybody's going to want to know who's listening or watching this is, what do you eat? Can you walk us through like a typical day? Like, do you eat breakfast, lunch, dinner, one meal a day, two meals? Like, walk us through a typical day for you.
Yeah, it is a little bit boring, not the question, but the answer. I typically eat 2 meals a day. Occasionally I'll have breakfast, but usually I don't eat my first meal of the day until 11 or 12, sometimes even 1. And then I typically have lunch and dinner. And the meals are, any meal is really exchangeable with any other. I don't have one meal that's more of a lunchy thing or a breakfasty thing. I'll eat bacon and eggs any time of day. But that's not really my mainstay. Beef is the thing that I eat the most. So I'll eat burgers, I'll eat steak. I also eat plenty of pork and chicken. I prefer the fatty cuts strongly though. If it's too lean, it just kind of puts me off. I do eat fish and shellfish. I love oysters, but I don't eat them every day, partly for cost reasons.
It's hard to get fresh oysters locally there in Colorado, right?
Yeah, we have something called oysters, but it's a different thing. And I haven't tried them yet because they always
Oh,
come breaded.
are you talking about the Rocky Mountain oysters?
Yes, that's still on my list.
You haven't had them yet. Okay, I haven't either, but
No, got to find a place that doesn't deep fry them in wheat.
yeah. Yeah, all right. And I saw a photo you posted yesterday about a very delicious looking raw meal that you did that was was that like a special occasion or just
I just
culinary?
kind of had a hankering for it. I don't mostly eat raw. Most of the time I eat sort of medium rare to rare.
Hmm.
But I do maybe a few times a month, I'll have a meal that's raw. What I had yesterday that you're talking about is I had I guess it was about a pound, maybe a little less of ground beef that was ground at a local store. Really like the way that they make it chunky. It's just a single grind
Mm.
and very fatty. And I had some raw egg yolks on top of that and some pieces of sashimi on the side. And it was just fantastic. I didn't do raw ground beef until, gee, what are we, 2017? I guess it was about 3 years ago that I really started getting into that because I had a friend who also was on a carnivore diet and he really liked raw ground beef and ate it a lot. And I had tried it, but even though I've overcome a lot of acculturation, it still seemed a little bit scary to me. But I tried it, and after a few go rounds, I started saying, wow, this is actually really, really good. Kind of a similar process to what I went through with sashimi. I was
Mm.
very fortunate in getting to try that when I was still a teenager. And so I didn't have a long history of feeling weird about raw fish. And I really love sashimi. And I know a lot of people who wouldn't bat an eye at eating sashimi, but when you
Hmm.
put a piece of raw beef on the table, it's a no. So I
Yeah,
really think
yeah.
it's an enculturation thing um, that I've developed a taste for.
Yeah, well, and I posted a comment on your post yesterday, but I had a flashback when I saw your pile of ground raw beef. Like when I was growing up, like every meal or every dinner my mom made was ground beef. That was just, in the 80s, that's what you did, right? Like ground beef was cheap and you could make so many things out of it. And so pretty much every dinner I remember was ground beef in some way or another. And so there was the raw meat before she cooked it. And I always wanted to try it, like, what, mom, can I eat it raw? What's it taste like? Right. And I
Right.
just didn't even remember that until seeing your post there. And it was like, it's really interesting because I was like, I don't know why I was compelled to want to eat it raw, and I would. And I was like, it's pretty good, right? And she couldn't really give me a good reason of why I shouldn't eat it raw, but it was kind of like because this was pre like worry about E. coli and all that stuff we've been, programmed to really worry about, right? But yeah, and it was more of like she didn't want me to eat it all before she could cook it for dinner, basically, I think is what it was. But
Yes.
she
Yes,
had
that
an
makes
inclination
sense.
that it's probably bad. I don't know why, so don't eat much of it. But yeah, you can take a little nibble here and there. So I wonder what it would have been like if I could have been eating a bunch of raw raw beef when I was growing up or something. So
Yeah, well, lucky you.
I
As a
don't know.
vegetarian, as coming from a vegetarian household, I obviously didn't have that experience. I did have raw
Ah,
cookie dough, but
okay.
that's a different thing.
Raw eggs. Oh my gosh, craziness. Yeah. Well, I do have one final question, but before I ask that, I want to ask, was there anything else that you were hoping I would ask you about or that you wanted to share now?
I don't think so. You're hitting all the right spots.
Okay. Yeah, well, okay, so my final question then is that today's your last day on the planet, the meteor's coming, we're all going to get wiped out today. What's going to be your final meal?
Oh my. Well, so the way you phrased that makes me think, what is something that I wouldn't eat now because it would affect my health, where it's not going to have any kind of health consequence? Oh, that is so difficult. And it's just been so long since I even thought that way. There must be something. There must be some kind of tort or custard or, um, you know, this is going to sound trite, but I really think I want a good steak.
Yeah, no, I love this question because, a lot of people are like, gosh, I just love what I eat so much. Like that tastes the best. I want to keep eating that. And other people are like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have like chocolate cake and mousse and ice cream or something. So there's no wrong answer, right? It's just curious. It's a curious question.
Ice
If there were
cream.
no consequences, what would you eat?
Ice cream is, it was previously my absolute downfall. There's just something particularly luscious about ice cream. And even when I was eating ketogenic, I used to make my own ice cream out of real cream, and I'd take frozen fruit and just blend that up to get that texture and taste. The other thing that I really, really loved before low carb was French fries
Hmm.
and a good dark porter beer.
Okay. All right. We got a good meal here for you. Nice. Well, Amber, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing all of this. You're a super awesome, smart person, and I just love all the information that you're sharing. We're going to link all your your website, your blog, your contact info down below so that people can follow you and your journey and get some more information if this is sparking some interest in them of at least doing a carnivore experiment. I love that that's your recommendation. It's like, just give it a try, see what happens. And so if you guys like this interview, give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see more. That's all we've got for now, but we'll be back soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.